Okay, welcome everybody to the first main session of the conference. I'm Mike Clarke. I'm based in Queen's University, Belfast in Northern Ireland, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator for this session where we have three speakers, and I will introduce each of them in turn. First two will be presenting live, and then we have a video recording from Toby Lasserson. The session, so I'll just say a few words about the session and then hand over to Olav Vandvik, who will be our first speaker. So the idea behind the session is we've all probably become very familiar over the last 2.5 years with the COVID-19 pandemic and its associated measures with rapidly evolving evidence, rapidly changing evidence. But evidence has been changing quickly for a long time now. It's just perhaps that we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years what we might have seen spread over a decade or more for other areas of healthcare. But alongside that, we've also had to recognize that as evidence evolves, we need to try and keep up to date with it. And that's what we're going to be hearing about today. And I'm sure you'll hear about it even more in other parts of the conference. And also there is a workshop dedicated to the topic. So we're struggling to try and keep ourselves aware of the research evidence. If we are in the business of producing evidence or in the business of synthesizing evidence, we're trying to keep the users of that evidence up to date with the material. And there are many challenges, challenges of the speed with which evidence is being produced and whether or not those who synthesize that evidence and use it for guidelines can keep pace. How do we ensure that we have the most up-to-date information available? How do we ensure that the information that we have available, becoming available very quickly, is not in some ways biased? And again, people will be familiar, I'm sure, with the experience through COVID-19 of studies reaching the literature, maybe because they had particularly findings, and then studies with less exciting but maybe more realistic findings would appear weeks or months later. So how does the evidence synthesis community keep up with that, and how do we enhance the supply of evidence to our users? So that's my words of introduction to try and set the scene. I look forward very much to learning more from our three speakers. How we will do this is each of them has been asked to speak for up to 20 minutes. We'll, as I've said, we'll hear from Olav first, and what we won't do is take questions after each speaker. If the speakers finish slightly early, then maybe there will be time for 1 or 2 questions, but ideally I'd like to keep all of the questions until the end. For the questions, please type them into the questions and answers box. We're not going to attempt to put written answers into that box unless they're questions about organizational matters or so on. If they're questions for the speakers, then my role when we reach the end of Toby Lasserson's video, my role will be to work us through the questions that are in that box and pose them to our speakers who are here, and perhaps to others who are involved in the conference as well, who may also be able to add, given that Toby's not available with us live. So I'll begin just introducing our first speaker, who I can see is available. Olav, do you want to just turn on the camera? So there we can see you. Brilliant. So Olav is Professor of Medicine at the University of Oslo in Norway. He's co-founder and chief executive officer of the Magic Evidence Ecosystem Foundation, with academic interests on evidence synthesis, appraisal, guideline methodology, dissemination, access, and use of evidence at the point of care, with a passion to ensure that evidence-based practice and shared decision-making can take place, and can take place in a reliable and robust way. So if you're ready, I'm not sure if you'll be sharing slides, Olav, or if Mohammed will share them, but if we're ready, the slides will come up. Brilliant. Okay, over to you, Olav.
Thanks so much, Mike, and thanks to Lubna and organizers for inviting me to give this talk in this wonderful virtual international conference. So I have been given the task of talking about the evidence ecosystem, and Mike shortly outlined my background. I will talk about or describe evolution of an evidence ecosystem from a magic perspective. It's clear that I may have some, at least intellectual conflicts. I will start out though by talking about evidence-based healthcare advances and how guidelines are critical for those of us meeting patients in our practice. I'll talk a little bit about technology, how we developed a platform to achieve more efficient authoring and dissemination and dynamic updating of trustworthy guidelines. And then a few words about evidence still being in silos and why we moved to develop what we called a digital and trustworthy evidence ecosystem, but also talk a little bit about different evidence ecosystem models. And then I'll show how this all has worked in the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly focusing in on living systematic use and living guidelines, and then highlight some definite challenges in particular to reach global impact on whatever we do in evidence healthcare and guidelines. So it is clear that following the evolution of evidence-based healthcare over 30 years, we've moved to emphasizing how clinicians and their patients can make use of trustworthy evidence and guidelines. Guidelines are critical because we have so limited time in our practice. We typically give up after 2 minutes if we can't find an answer to that clinical question. And these guidelines, they have to be trustworthy and timely and accessible at the point of care. Now, this means that organizations that produce such guidelines need to apply best current standards, and Lubna already introduced Institute of Medicine and GIN standards, but also methods for evidence synthesis as nicely outlined in the Cochrane Handbook, and GRADE for evidence appraisal and for moving from evidence to recommendation. So these are really challenging standards and methods. But in addition to this, we should make use of technology and also innovate processes to more rapidly go from new evidence to guidance and an impact on care. And this is where magic started, 2010, together with our mentor Gordon Guyett and other colleagues. We thought hard about how we could make use of technology and platforms to enhance these guidelines. And this is just a picture of one platform. It's our Magic Authoring and Publication platform, Magic App, where now an increasing number of organizations go online and they create the entire guideline in a structured format, from PICO questions to grade evidence summaries to recommendations in a database. And this allows the automated publication in what we call multi-layered formats, find recommendations first, then click find more. You can also integrate the recommendations that are now the entities. It's no longer a PDF into electronic health records. You could plug them into websites, portals, pathways, local protocols, EBM textbooks, and it should be easier to adapt, contextualize, and translate guidelines through using such technology. We also realized we needed tools for shared decision-making, so you could produce what we call conversation decision aids by grade evidence summaries from this platform. And then up to the far left, we have the arrow saying dynamic updating, which is actually the concept of living guidelines that I'll come back to. Now, I should have had the time to talk a lot more about technology, but I want to really point you to a great workshop tomorrow, 2:30 p.m. Riyadh time, which is called Fever, and it's Brian Alper is going to present some great advances in how we could use new standards called FIRE, and you could actually take such content and make use of it in many different ways, including electronic healthcare records and decision support systems. So please visit the Fever workshop. Now, we were quite happy with having developed Magic App in 2013, but we quickly realized that guidelines don't really matter if they don't have an impact. And evidence did at that time largely remain siloed, and I think that's still the case. We have the additional problems of most research representing waste, as nicely shown in the Lancet series in 2013. There's a mass epidemic of useless and flawed systematic reviews and guidelines, nicely showed by John Ioannidis and some disturbing papers he's written. And then how could we work with quality improvers? At the silo to the right, I think it's fair to say that many quality improvers, implementers, not necessarily understand the value of refined, trustworthy evidence and guidance to base their efforts on. And we'll come back to whether any improvements have been made for COVID-19. But this picture of these silos triggered us to create what we call a digital and trustworthy evidence ecosystem. And this picture shows our conceptual framework that we launched in 2014, just showing how we need to move much more quickly from produced evidence. We need more reliable and relevant evidence. And then that should be followed by evidence syntheses at the global level within months, not years. And the evidence syntheses, the system I use, should feed health technology assessments, guideline development. Again, not after years, but maybe months, or how about weeks. And then we should disseminate this evidence, open access globally to policymakers, clinicians, and patients. The last steps being critical: how could we implement the evidence and guidance in healthcare systems and practice? And how could we evaluate impact? But also, just as important, how could we produce new evidence that would feed into this loop? And this is what we call an evidence ecosystem. In the middle, there are some key requirements that I'll come back to, but it is clear that it's not easy to enhance such an evidence ecosystem. And this has been the vision for MAGIC since 2014. In 2016, we realized we were a bit frustrated by the fact that organizations struggle to innovate the way they work. So we thought we should be able to show that we can turn new evidence into trustworthy guidelines within 90 days. That was the goal. And we created a project called the BMJ Rapid Recommendations with the BMJ as a partner. And we have published a bit more than 20 guidelines since then. And Kameshwar is going to show how one of these were developed in a global network of people without conflict of interests, including patient partners, and continuously innovating also how we publish these guidelines. So this was an important step for us to enhance the evidence ecosystem, in particular on the evidence synthesis and guideline side. Now, in 2018, I realized, and I shouldn't have been surprised, but there were several evidence ecosystem models out there. And I was asked to write a paper for the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology, which was an educational exercise for me. So I found that there was a ecosystem of evidence model here to the left from Nino and colleagues in Italy, focusing a lot on evidence syntheses and to some extent, but not much guidelines. There was another series of papers on evidence ecosystems from the wonderful Cochrane group in France, Isabelle Boutron, who's giving another talk at this conference, again focusing a lot on evidence synthesis and in particular network meta-analyses, and they have for sure had a breakthrough from the COVID-19 pandemic. Cochrane has their ecosystem, mostly on Cochrane reviews, again, evidence syntheses. JBI has a very similar kind of circle and the JBI Wheel of Evidence, and they come from a kind of the implementation side of this evidence ecosystem with some great insights. Lots of models. In the paper I wrote up with Lynn Brandt, the mastermind behind MAGIC app, the conclusions were that they're all, and that's great to say in this conference, based on evidence-based medicine. We basically all agree on the problems, but most of the emphasis is on evidence synthesis and guidance, much less clear on the final and critical steps of implementation and evaluation of impact. Of course, like Lubna said, this conference is about impact, and we better make sure that the evidence-based healthcare community can fully support implementers and improvers in making an impact, both at the global and national and local level. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic, and already alluded to several times in the first hour of this conference. In February, more than 700,000 publications, more than 5,000 trials, just in the area of therapeutics that we have been working on. But again, some great advances. So all these trials, all this evidence, like also Mike highlighted, how do we deal with this to inform policy and practice? This is a nice cartoon from a paper we published in Nature in December 21. Lots of people here involved in what has been a true breakthrough for living evidence and guidance. And this shows the big friendly giant taking the papers from the desks of the researchers to the hands of policymakers and clinicians in a very new way and very promising way. Of course, we all know that guidelines are typically updated every 3 to 5 years. Just before the pandemic, you can see here, the first stroke guideline was published by pioneers in Australia, now the Australian Living Evidence Consortium. And during COVID, we were able to work and get the time from a trigger trial to publication has gone down to 20 days, in particular from Australia. This is a huge shift in how we update guidelines. Just a reminder, what is living evidence and guidance? Well, for guidelines, we still have to climb the steep hill to develop the first version of the guideline, but then a traditional model means that they lose currency and reliability. Then you have to steep that climb hill again, very resource demanding. The difference with living guidelines is that you still have to climb that steep hill, but then you maintain the currency by doing evidence monitoring and living systematic reviews. So that's the model of living evidence and guidance. Just an example how MAGIC has been working in this evidence ecosystem with living guidelines. We have monitored trials for COVID-19 therapeutics in particular. We've had wonderful support from McMaster doing a living systematic review and network meta-analyses. Cochrane group has done similar wonderful work, sharing the evidence on their website so everybody could access it. And then we have worked from MAGIC using the platform, supporting WHO for their living guidelines and being a part of our BMJ rapid recommendations. And in Australia and NICE and in more countries have used this approach and this platform to create, update and disseminate guidelines within weeks following new evidence in COVID-19. So this has been a wonderful learning experience, but also highlights a number of challenges with living guidelines that should go beyond COVID-19 at this stage. Just to give examples of how the guidelines look like and how they're published, this is the WHO therapeutics guideline, screenshot of the BMJ publication with infographics. We do know that healthcare professionals and patients like to see evidence presented in user-friendly ways, and these have been well received in terms of explaining who the patients are. You have to know about the severity, and we have everything from strong recommendations for to strong recommendation against an increasing number of drugs for COVID-19. To the right, you see you can click the infographic and you find these great summary findings, with the merits being absolute effects and certainty, and you can click and find more in the MAGIC app. I'll show an example in a few minutes how this looks like from another guideline. Just to highlight the critical importance of living evidence synthesis, this is the network meta-analyses that we have built recommendations on with WHO, and it's massive work, 50 people working every day to update this rapidly growing evidence base for COVID-19 therapeutics. And many questions arise in terms of how do we communicate this evidence to the end users? How do we publish in the journal? BMJ is very innovative, but still has been hard to publish updates rapidly enough, which makes it easier to do this through online platforms and portals like I think both Cochrane and McMaster have provided end users with. I want to show you now live the Australian Living Guidelines for COVID-19. This picture shows their portal, but I'll show you how we now increasingly want to enhance dissemination of guidelines and living guidelines through different mechanisms. And I hope you now can see so I'm just checking with Mike. Can you see this website now, Mike? I would think so. Yeah, good, thanks. So this is the landing page, the portal for the National COVID-19 Task Force in Australia. And it's the best portal website I've seen. It also shows how we could provide top what the most recent updates are. So if I want to know about this drug favipiravir, you click on this link, and that's what we call a widget in Magic App. So you go straight from in this case, a portal, but it could also be another way to disseminate the evidence. You click, and then you go straight into the database where we find the specific recommendations. Oh, it's a strong recommendation against this drug, some remarks. And for each recommendation in this platform, you'll find the great evidence summaries. They're multi-layered. You'll find all the patient important outcomes, the relative effects, the absolute effects, the signal of harm here, 4 more deaths per 1,000, the certainty. If you want to drill down and find out where this comes from, it's a systematic review, which is a requirement for trustworthy guidelines. And you could find individual patient data even deeper down in this multi-layered format. And you have rationale and you have decision aids, so you can share the evidence with your patients. So there's been a great progress in how we disseminate guidelines, how we use these different mechanisms. You also have nice flowcharts where you again can click and find recommendations within the flowchart. So I encourage you to have a look at these guidelines. Very impressive. Nice, similar progress. They also have a website where they plug in these links and recommendations. Again, going to Magic App in this case. And it's interesting to see how their new strategy, that I'm also very impressed by, focuses on living and dynamic guideline recommendations and how to maximize impact of the guidelines. So this is really driving how NICE is moving forward. And I think also WHO has the similar 2 key strategic objectives moving forward for the guidelines, most of which will now be in the Magic App, by the way. So to close this off pretty soon now, Mike, I think it's fair to say we need to think within an evidence ecosystem framework, also in the evidence-based healthcare community. But we are, I would say, only halfway there, because we need to make sure that the guidelines and the evidence syntheses that we support policy and practice with actually can be disseminated. And now I want to highlight also adapted and translated, because to succeed with updating evidence syntheses and guidelines, I think we have to collaborate internationally, but then rather adapt, contextualize, translate recommendations, and then implement efficiently through different strategies and evaluate impact. So I think the future now is to focus on how we could collaborate globally. And the next case will be diabetes. I'll just show you that example to close off. And there will be many other examples where we can demonstrate global collaboration, but also then study how we could more efficiently implement and evaluate impact on care and policy. So for diabetes, I think this is soon to come from some of the same players. We have new, very effective drugs. It's an epidemic of diabetes type 2 in the world. 802 trials, 462,000 patients on some new and very effective drugs, and more is coming. We have Cochrane, we have McMaster, we have the same actors now joining forces to show we can actually do the same as we did with COVID for a topic like diabetes type 2. Again, we should focus on that red box. How do we complete the loop and close it? Our learning has been that all organizations want to collaborate to reduce duplication and enhance efficiency, but I don't think this will work unless we have explicit agreement on some standards, say for trustworthy guidelines, how we use methods such as GRADE, and perhaps even more importantly, how we coordinate our processes, how we collaborate in this evidence ecosystem. And again, technology, digitally structured data can help, but it's just a facilitator to enhance this evidence ecosystem. So this is a challenge, and we are devoted to work with all interested parties to make this work and show success. So I think it's fair to say that looking at these great advances in evidence-based healthcare and guidelines, standards, methods, processes, platforms, living guidelines is here to stay. I think this idea of an evidence ecosystem as a framework is helpful, but again, we have to really agree on how we're going to work together. And I'm looking forward to how the evidence-based healthcare community can support those interested in providing a true impact on policy and care based on best current research evidence. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Olav, for absolutely fascinating. Some stuff I knew about, some stuff is new to me. It's brilliant to see what COVID potentially, accelerated. In a bad way, COVID has caused so much misery over the last few years, but it's given us opportunities to accelerate and to test bed. And I'm so excited to see that you're moving from the COVID to a new condition, just to show those learnings and put them into practice. So as I said at the beginning, we'll take questions properly at the end. If people have questions, please put them into the Q&A slot. We're not using chat for everybody. But if you have questions, put them into Q&A and I'll come back to them after we've finished with all of the three talks today. I'm bursting with questions, but I want other people to have that opportunity. So we'll move on to the next speaker, and I'm delighted to be able to ask Kameshwar Prasad to give us the next talk, where he'll be looking at developing a practice-changing rapid clinical practice guideline using GRADE. Olav has already hinted at some of the content for this. Very pleased to be able to introduce Kameshwar, who is the current president of the International Society of Evidence-Based Healthcare and Chief Executive Officer at Rajendra Institute of Medical Sciences in India. He's championed for some time now the philosophy and practice of evidence-based healthcare at both the national and the international level. And I'm hoping that he is here. I'm looking around my screen. Mohammed, can you confirm whether or not Kameshwar is here?
Actually, doctor is not joined yet. I'm looking for him. Can you give us like 3 minutes only?
Okay. So we'll take a pause for everybody. Give him his sort of scheduled start time is still 3 minutes away, and he may have had some difficulties in connecting. So we'll pause things for 3 minutes. If he's not here in 3 or 4 minutes, Mohammed, I suggest that we move and maybe show Toby's video. But let's wait 4 minutes from now, and again, I encourage people to spend this time putting questions into the Q&A, which I'll come back and ask Olav about when we've finished with all three speakers.
Hey, Dr. Mike, I think Dr. Kameshwar is not answering now. Can we move on to Dr. Toby, please?
Yes. Okay. So if you get the video ready, Mohammed, I'll just say my words of introduction for Toby. Toby Lasserson unfortunately isn't able to be with us live, but he has recorded a video which Mohammed will play in a moment. Toby's Deputy Editor-in-Chief for the Cochrane Library. He's an expert in evidence synthesis, methods and reporting. I've worked with Toby for some time now as part of Cochrane, and Toby's going to speak to us about evidence synthesis challenges and opportunities. So we'll take the video from Toby. Hopefully Kameshwar will be able to join us then. If not, I'll move to the question and answers while we'll try and get Kameshwar online. So Mohammed, if you're ready, please play Toby's video.
Yes, it will start now.
Thank you. So Mohammed, I had Toby's first slide on screen, but then the screen has vanished. I do see.
Yeah, it will start now. Just give me a second.
No, we can wait, Mohammed, because I see that Kameshwar has arrived.
Yes.
And so I suggest we keep to the schedule. We'll keep Toby's back for 20 minutes while we hear from Kameshwar. Good early afternoon, probably, Kameshwar, for you in India.
Yeah, for me, and good morning to you. Good morning to you.
Okay. So I'll introduce you again so that we have it nicely captured in the video, and then if you're ready, you can begin the slideshow. So as I said, I'm delighted to be able to welcome Kameshwar Prasad as the current president of the International Society of Evidence-Based Healthcare. He's Director and Chief Executive Officer at Rajendra Institute of Medical Sciences in India. He's long been a champion of the philosophy and practice of evidence-based healthcare at both the national and the international level. And he's going to be speaking to us about developing a practice-changing rapid clinical practice guideline using GRADE. And as those of you who are with us for Olav's presentation, building on some of the things that MAGIC has been doing. Kameshwar, if you're ready, please share your screen and begin. And just for you, Kameshwar, what I've said to others, we'll take questions collectively after we've seen Toby's video. So if people have questions, please put them into the Q&A, and we'll be coming back to those after Toby's video. Over to you, Kameshwar.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thank you for your generous introduction. I will try to finish my talk within 20 minutes. And therefore, I'm going to touch upon a few of the topics. Let me see. Let me first go to slideshow. Can you see my slides?
Yes, Dr. Kameshwar,
Yes.
speak.
Yes, you can. Okay.
So basically, I'm going to introduce the topic with a couple of slides, then go through an example and share what lessons we have learned, which can be applied for rapid clinical guideline development, which can change practice. So this is a very well-known paper written by Morris, Wooding, and Grant, which is the answer is 17 years. What is the question? And that's a paper about time lags in translational research. And the question is how much time it takes for research evidence to be applied in practice. And it is frequently stated that it takes on average 17 years. And few experts have worked on it and estimated that there is a time lag of 17 years between research evidence coming to light and being applied in clinical practice. And they also presented a conceptual model why it takes 17 years. And they highlight 2 points. One is translational gap 1, which is between basic research and clinical research. And once clinical research has shown that some intervention is effective, then translating it into guideline and practice also takes time, which we may like to call translational gap 2. And therefore, to bridge this gap, guideline is a good tool. So COVID changed all of this. And as you must have heard, Purvich, who was a key member of guideline development in WHO during COVID time, that gap between research publication and guideline development was few weeks, not 17 years. But as you know, in normal time, routine practice, it is difficult to sustain and generalize. And I'm sure that WHO group also got a bit tired and must be relaxing now a bit. Most sustainable target may be a gap of 90 to 180 days. 90 days, what magic people have always espoused, but it's quite a I would say reasonable and quite substantial development. From 17 years, if we can come to 17 weeks, that's something which is remarkable. So I share one example which we achieved in 150 days. So this is a guideline, which is clinical practice guideline developed rapidly, as you can see, and published in British BMJ, which is about dual antiplatelet therapy with aspirin and clopidogrel in high-risk TIA and minor ischemic stroke. And if you see, the paper was published, the key paper was published on May 16, 2018. Actually in print, it came in on 19th July 2018, and our practice guideline was published on 18th December 2018, which is about 5 months, which is, I would say, rapid. And the lessons learned is something which I'm going to share with you. So the question is, and BMJ has been really leading this movement and have been very supportive. So what I have learned is that simultaneously you have to form 2 groups, and the 2 groups are not mutually exclusive. They may be partially overlapping, particularly methodologists may be in both the groups, because they help the clinician group to understand what the evidence is, and the review group to conduct the systematic review properly. So it's very important to have methodologists. And both groups, they work concurrently. And that is what happened in our experience. So as you can see, the guideline development group has not only subject area expert like neurologists and internal medicine people, but also methodologists. But more importantly, what I would say is that patient partners, as you can see, 3 patient partners and some caregiver partners, nurse, physiotherapist, all are very important. So all those who are involved in care and the patient's experience also shared by patient partners is very important in the guideline development group. So both groups start with defining clinical questions. Questions would generally be very similar, but may not necessarily be exactly same. And the PICO format is well known. I'm not going to deliberate on that. And systematic review groups develops a protocol around that PICO question, and guideline development group at the same time, after defining the clinical questions, may identify critical outcomes. And this is very important because these outcomes must be part of the systematic review. Another very important activity which goes on while the systematic review is being developed is to train the patient partners and caregiver partners to understand evidence as much as they can. So there is very important input of a patient input coordinator, and that's something every guideline development group may like to have. So the question which we had developed was, in patients with mild stroke and high-risk TIA, should we recommend aspirin and clopidogrel combination or aspirin or clopidogrel alone? And first thing which is required to be done by the guideline development group is to prioritize the outcome. And there is a rating which is designed by the grade group. from not important, which may be 0, to 9, which is critical. And anything which is 7, 8, 9 is considered critical. So while guideline development group identified several outcomes, when they were asked to rate, and this rating scale, which you can see 7, 8, 9 are critical, 4, 5, 6 important but not critical for decision making, and 1, 2, 3 is not important. So if you use that, then this is what the guideline development group did. In our case, death was, of course, very important, non-fatal recurrent stroke, major non-CNS bleeding, functional outcome, and quality of life. These are the outcomes which had scored on an average 7 or more. So that is what is critical outcome. And then in the middle of the activity, the systematic review group develops the systematic review, often accompanied with meta-analysis and summary of findings table, while at the same time, guideline development group may conduct a systematic review or survey or focus group discussion on patient values and preferences for the outcomes which they have identified. And when we say values and preferences, it is a broad term which includes patient's perspective, beliefs, expectations, goals for their health and life, which in a way takes into account benefits, harm, cost, burden associated with different treatment and different management options. These values and preferences may be determined using several strategies, which obviously is beyond the scope of my talk, but you may use several techniques, time trade-off, standard gamble, and so on. So essentially what we asked, for example, in our case is how important is decrease in stroke risk, and is this importance attached to decrease in stroke risk variable across patients? And similarly, how important it is to have an increase in bleeding risk, and how similar or variable is this importance across various patients or stakeholders. So when we ask these questions, we have to use some kind of summary where we have to summarize whether there is little variability, where most patients would like to attribute great importance to some particular outcome, moderate variability, or great variability. So we used a systematic review of patient values and preferences. Fortunately, it was already published in 2012. We say that between stroke and bleed, the trade-off is 2:1 or 3:1. So that is the kind of values and preferences summarized in this systematic review. For every stroke prevented, patients tend to accept 2 to 3 bleeds. So in the final stage, guideline development group deliberates on each clinical question. It interprets the summary of findings table provided by the systematic review, and then it takes into account trade-offs between benefit and risk, many practical issues like feasibility, acceptability, and cost, all of this to travel from evidence to recommendation. And as I said, help of a methodologist is very important. And sometimes if there is no, let's say, consensus, you may have to resort to voting. But very often, certainly in our case, the decisions were unanimous. We were perhaps lucky. So for this question, as you may have, if you go through the BMJ website, you will find this type of what you call grade map or grade profile, which is already published. You can, it is interactive and you can play with it. Paul must have alluded to this. I'm not going into the details. And then it is presented in a very graphical, pictorial form, which is very easy to understand. When they present the summary of findings table, it looks like this, where the absolute difference is shown very clearly. For example, in this case, there will be 14 fewer stroke of people disabled in modified Rankin scale of MRS 2 to 5. That is for major stroke, which is disabling. So we recommended dual antiplatelet therapy. But the second question was how long to give this treatment. I'm not going into details again, but we had to conduct, this is what we asked the systematic reviewers to do analysis, which was additional to what they had done, which they were very kind enough to do for us. Again, we could compare the effect between 0 to 10 days, 11 to 21 days and more. And we found that 0 to 10 days, there is very clear benefit, much less between 11 to 21 days, but certainly not after 21 days. So this helps us to arrive at a recommendation for duration of treatment. And we recommended 21 days. Now, the idea is not to go into details of my example, but to illustrate that this is possible, and it is possible by going through certain process, which some of which I'm sure Per has already highlighted, but I'm just illustrating this with our example. And certain challenges which we face in low and middle income countries, very important to recognize that patient participation is neither recognized as important nor acknowledged by physicians or guideline developers in general. You will hardly find a guideline developed in LMIC where, unless it was sponsored by WHO, you will hardly find patient input. Patients also are either unwilling or unable to participate. Unable, I said, sometimes because of, you can say, lack of education, but sometimes also because any time which they give to the guideline development is actually in the terms of wages lost. So there is a cost to it. The opportunity cost of participating is so much that they are probably not ready to participate. There is another problem which I think is to be recognized, is that grade is, fortunately now everybody seems to have heard the name, but they are not really good at understanding the methodology. And this is where I am trying to establish a network in India so that the message goes on and this becomes well known and people are expert enough to participate in guideline development. So to summarize, undue delay is very well known, well recorded in literature. Translation of research evidence into practice is something which you hear in practically every conference. But COVID-19 did a good thing, that it showed that it is possible to accelerate the process, and particularly guideline development occurred very rapidly. In routine situation, when we are not facing a pandemic, perhaps that speed is difficult to achieve, but living guideline, as Per must have alluded to, or if there is no guideline, then a rapid guideline development is possible. And it requires, we know the steps which are involved. And grade is, I think, more or less accepted internationally as a method to develop guideline, and it is evidence-based. So if we follow the steps according to grade, I think it is possible to conclude development of a guideline in 90 to 180 days, which will certainly, I would like to call a rapid guideline development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well, Kameshwar, for such a clear and clean and precise presentation, and for your leadership in these activities, and reflecting on what you've said and what Olav said, the advances that have been possible through the challenging 2 or 3 years that we've all been through. So as I've said, please, if people would like to put their questions into the Q&A, see we've got a few in there already, which we'll come back to in about 20 minutes time once we've had Toby's video. Mohammed, are you ready with Toby's video? And as I said last time, what happened was the screen appeared with Toby's first slide, and then it disappeared again before Kameshwar joined us.
Yeah,
So
it's
I'll just,
better now.
go on, Mohammed, go on. Okay. So I'll just say, repeat the words of introduction for Toby. Toby unfortunately isn't able to be with us today, so he's recorded the video. Toby is Deputy Editor-in-Chief for the Cochrane Library and is an expert in evidence synthesis, methods and reporting. And as I mentioned before, I've worked with Toby for a long time inside Cochrane, and he's going to present to us on the challenges and opportunities for the future of evidence synthesis. Thank you, Mohammed, if you're ready to play. So again, as a reminder, please put any questions into Q&A.
I'm Toby Lasserson. I'm Deputy Editor-in-Chief of the Cochrane Library, and I'm really bad at pre-recording presentations to PowerPoint slides. Whilst I could dwell on that as a challenge and an opportunity for evidence synthesis, you'll be relieved to know that I'm going to focus on things that frankly are much more relevant to the job of bridging the gap and enhancing the evidence supply, which I think are about connecting users with data. Before I give my presentation though, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the organisational change in Cochrane, which is coming over the next few years. Cochrane's moving to formally separate review development functions from editorial functions. Editorial functions are going to be centralised, and review development is going to be in the hands of thematic groups and evidence synthesis units to replace the current structure of 52 Cochrane review groups. The journey to a new organisational structure is going to have to take account of two key challenges to the evidence synthesis process. And those two challenges are about timelines and how we can shorten them, and also about currency, how we can make the timing of the evidence that we produce right for the users that we're producing it for. Now, at face value, these look like one and the same thing. I see them as two sides of the same coin, and I hope to show that whilst they are indeed related, we do in fact need to think of them as quite distinct things. I hope to be able to persuade you by the end of my talk that evidence synthesis now really needs to be seen and embraced, not really as sort of compiling a retrospective view on a group of studies, but more as a sort of living process that charts the accumulation of data. Now, anyone who's done a systematic review will know that one of the most fundamental requirements is a systematic search. That means looking in more than one place, and it means being comprehensive. And I have nothing against either of those two things. Having a replicable process ultimately is what we should try and aim for. But having to repeat this arduous task through the life of a systematic review, either before a new version is published or to initiate an update, can feel like quite an arduous task. And nobody really wants it to become a boulder that you have to carry around, or like Sisyphus found, a boulder that you keep having to push up a hill. So we need to ask ourselves, how can we make it feel less like a burden, but without compromising the rigor and the standards that we know that users are expecting from us? I've included on my slides a QR code where I'm presenting the findings or summarising the findings of a particular article. So you can, the top right hand corner of the screen is a link to this particular article that was published in Systematic Reviews by Elaine Beller and colleagues a number of years ago, who were very interested in the question of how up-to-date systematic reviews were at the time of their publication. Now, the short answer to that question, and posed by the title of this article, really is that it's quite hard to say. And the reason I think it's hard to say is because it's not so much about the distance in time that we should be worried about, although an average of 8 months between the last search and the publication probably should trigger alarm bells with a few of us. But the real dilemma and the real uncertainty that I think many of us have when we're looking at a review or we're doing one is that unless we're aware of recent studies which are likely to impact on the synthesis that we're actually going ahead with, we don't always know whether the findings that we've actually got to work with are reliable or potentially dangerously out of date. So the question I really want to try and get to the heart of here is, how do we get out of this searching trap? So Cochrane is looking to scale up a project that builds on some recent developments in machine learning and crowdsourcing. Those are two words or two concepts that many years ago nobody had any idea would come to represent the change to the process that I think we can now quite confidently say is going to be the future of evidence synthesis. The Cochrane evidence pipeline, which is what you can see represented by this figure here, is a study identification and curation workflow. So at the top, potentially relevant study records are identified through daily or even weekly searches conducted across a range of bibliographic and trial register sources, and they come into the pipeline. The records then go through a series of routines with the aim of deduplicating against what we already have and identifying and tagging any new evidence that might be relevant to Cochrane. We use semi-automation to do this with machine learning classifiers and crowdsourcing by the Cochrane Crowd. The Cochrane evidence pipeline helps to feed important repositories of studies such as Central and the COVID-19 study register. And it also helps to identify studies for specific Cochrane reviews through what we call the Screen for Me service. This is a snapshot that you can see from a recent Screen for Me challenge. And some of that Sisyphusian effort that I referred to earlier can indeed be picked up by citizen scientists or volunteers. And this has already helped a number of priority Cochrane reviews by organising these sort of discrete screening events. And you can see here that this was a review that we did quite recently on home visiting for socially disadvantaged mothers, where an update search yielded quite a number of records, and we had to find ways to quite quickly make that number much more manageable for the author team who are stretched for time. And making the process, dare I say it, somewhat enjoyable and interactive, where you get feedback on your performance, has helped to make reviews like this a bit more participatory, and I think has made the job of that, rolling the boulder up the hill a little bit easier for all to try and manage. And one of the most important things that we can do when contemplating the kind of change represented by the evidence pipeline is to try and evaluate it. And these are three really important questions, two of which we have some fairly definitive answers to. So, can you get machines to correctly identify RCTs? Can you just search Central? What a change that would be. And can you get machines to predict which studies will be relevant to your systematic review? Now, the answer to that first question, predictably enough, is a little bit more complicated than I was hoping it would be. We can probably get machines to correctly identify what's not a randomized controlled trial with a classifier, and that's what we use in the evidence pipeline. Through that mechanism, it helps to reduce the number of records that are retrieved by the centralized search activities by around 60%. So it takes away quite a lot of the stuff we know isn't going to be relevant to many of our reviews. And we also use it at the review level in our Screen for Me workflow. Reducing the number of sources needed for a review of RCTs is also quite a hot question within Cochrane. And a fairly recent evaluation that was conducted by Alan Ulstor and colleagues identified that 97.5% of the RCTs included in Cochrane reviews were actually listed in Central at the time of the search for those particular studies. Again, the QR codes that link to the articles that provide that information is included on the right-hand side. For this last question, can you get machines to predict which studies will be relevant to the review? That's subject to an ongoing evaluation, hence there's no QR code yet. But we need to also ask, is it only ever about dates? Timing is also an important consideration. And the reviews that we publish, I don't think should be a history lesson. Reviews that address high priority questions in fast moving fields, or even fields that just move at a more leisurely pace than we saw with COVID, they're often struggling with a moving target. The question can change as our understanding about the PICO, population, intervention, comparison and outcome itself evolves. The evidence can move quickly, or even when a landmark trial publishes, it can shift the dial in a way that it's going to be a struggle for an author team working on a review to keep up with, unless they're very much on top of the evidence, or they're doing that after the fact. But understanding how to aim for and hit a moving target is never easy. And searching, ultimately, in my view, is too much of a retrospective snapshot to really help us understand how quickly a field really is moving. And so a move to surveillance for ongoing and completed studies which have yet to give us results is actually needed. Because collecting and managing data should be part of an ongoing process. And it's these developments that were tested during COVID and that have emerged stronger from the pandemic, when studies, predominantly RCTs, were releasing data via preprint servers weeks in advance of publication. For those of us who were involved in doing reviews or editing reviews during that particular period of our history, will know just how disruptive it was, but ultimately also how necessary it was. So a more dynamic approach, a living synthesis, actually makes a virtue out of timing. It makes a virtue out of staying in touch with the most recent developments. And that means adopting a much more prospective approach. And a prospective approach towards accumulating evidence is exactly what we saw in the team who were doing a review on convalescent plasma in COVID-19. And we published and maintained this review throughout 2020 and into 2021. Convalescent plasma, which is derived from donated blood products, was touted as an effective treatment for COVID quite early in 2020. But the evidence base, from RCTs at least, took some months to mature and deliver more definitive results. Now on this screen you can see a graph that shows the number of included and ongoing studies by design, so by RCT and by non-randomized studies. This covers the four published versions of the review over this 12-month period. You might be interested to note that there were always more ongoing studies than there were completed ones. And it wasn't until very late on that we obviously saw more definitive results come through from randomized controlled trials. The eligibility criteria of the review also changed over the course of those four versions. And that also explains why the number of non-randomized studies which were included initially were eventually displaced by randomized trials as they reached endpoint. So on the left of the screen, you can see that with few eligible randomized trials available, the certainty of evidence was very low. There was also quite scant data very early on in sort of May 2020. By the time we'd published the fourth edition of the review, many thousands of patients had already contributed data to the randomized trials. And of course, the lack of effect in mortality was confirmed by multiple studies. So how do we overcome the static nature of printing research evidence through articles in journals or through the Cochrane Library when the evidence moves quickly? The challenge as I see it is that we've set up author teams, people who do systematic reviews, to be responsive to changes in the evidence base. That creates the need to update reviews, of course. But if we think about this differently, we can see an opportunity, and that is simply that we use what we know about ongoing studies to anticipate that change and stay ahead of the evidence. The mantra that I think we should all be living by in the future is that there are no surprises on PubMed. So by the time a research study publishes, we're already well aware of what it's going to tell us. So why should systematic review teams be like the Roman god of transitions who was two-faced? Janus had one eye on the past and one eye looking to the future. In other words, he was searching PubMed and scanning trials registers to inform future plans for updates of his reviews. Janus was lucky enough to have two heads, whereas all the author teams I've ever met and worked with in Cochrane have been composed entirely of people who only have one. Now, a prospective approach to evidence synthesis, as proposed by Jane Tierney and colleagues, has given me plenty to ponder. It was published last year and outlines these 6 principles called the FAME principles, and you can see a link to the review in the top left-hand corner of the screen. So Jane Tierney and colleagues articulate in their paper 6 principles for the Framework for Adaptive Meta-Analysis, or FAME. Now, as you can see, the principles go through sequentially how people should approach a prospective approach to evidence synthesis. Namely, that you start the review before the trials report results, you keep a dialogue going with trialists to get a picture of how the eligible studies are progressing, and that informs the earliest possible timing for your analysis. And also, you should be looking to register and publish the protocol before the trials produce the results. And it gives you an opportunity when you do conduct your analysis to think about both what you know has happened, i.e. the trials that have delivered results, but also because your understanding's been enriched by your earlier interaction with the trialists and your understanding of how those trials have been designed and when data are collected, it'll give you an opportunity to think about how the unavailable data could come in and enrich that analysis at the right time. It also gives you pause to think about when the right time to update your meta-analysis will be. So these steps are intended to get review teams to focus not just on that interactive approach or that dynamic approach to evidence synthesis, which living systematic reviews would encourage us to think about, but also, and quite critically, on the timing of the synthesis, because it involves building in correspondence with trialists, and establishing this approach protects against some of that search capture which can happen later on in the systematic review process. And as you can see from this image, which is published in that paper, this puts the synthesis more squarely alongside ongoing studies, rather than months or even years after the completion of the trials. Will this approach become standard? Living systematic reviews are now very common, and updating cycles for living systematic reviews are going to be quite short. I see principles like the ones outlined in the FAME approach as being a really helpful way to give people tools and a basic structure to approach their analysis, and to encourage better dialogue between primary research and people doing systematic reviews. Even though there are clearly different factors at play between infectious disease outbreaks and chronic disease, where in an emergency response situation, trials will reach endpoint quite rapidly, and chronic disease will naturally have longer endpoints, there are still some really useful ways, I think, to help people plan ahead and stay on top of the evidence. Because the truth of it is that irrespective of the area that you're working in, the content area, topic area that you're working in, and how quickly the evidence is moving, we always need, as systematic reviewers, the insights to be able to know when the outcome measurements aren't being standardized. We also, I think, need to try and find ways to target our resources better so we can get to the signal for the updates rather than embrace the noise. In other words, identify the questions, maybe even the comparisons or just outcomes, where ongoing studies are likely to deliver us results which are going to change those particular findings. It will also help us, I think, ultimately to reduce bias arising from the selective presentation of results, which we rely through journal articles on. It helps us think about subgroup analysis in a way that's a bit more reliable than the aggregate level that we have now, and it probably opens up the idea that ultimately an IPD or an individual participant data analysis might be the way to go for some questions. It also means that we have no surprises on PubMed because we've already captured or got information about the studies which are most likely to help us in the long run, and ultimately reduce more research is needed as the headline finding from our reviews. So what have I learned about staying on top of the evidence? Well, it's hard, but if we stay focused on the users and how we can get them to connect to the data that we're summarizing, we'll do a good job for them. Also, accepting innovation, technological innovation, requires methodological validation as well as proof of impact. In other words, we need to have an evidence-based method, but we also need to know ultimately it's going to make a difference to the user. Embracing technological innovation does shorten the timeline, but remember, it only ever helps you get to the difficult bits more quickly. Prospective approaches to evidence synthesis will inevitably lead to more dialogue between primary study investigators and systematic review teams. And we need to make sure that the role of the systematic reviewer in this remains focused on appraising independently the data that's generated from primary research. So we need mechanisms in place to keep that independence and to retain trust. Lastly, living processes are unquestionably resource hungry. Teams may have to be convened quickly to work on systematic reviews or to have a skeleton staff in place to keep data collection and data management systems ongoing. And we may never truly reduce the Sisyphusian workload completely, or never abolish it. But with changes to how we supply boulders and how we help him move them around, we could make parts of his job easier and all of it just a bit more interesting. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so thanks to Toby. Apologies for people that were having difficulties with the sound of Toby's. I'm afraid there wasn't much we were able to do. Toby provided the video, I think, on Friday, and we struggled to improve it, but hopefully people got the messages clearly from the slides or from what you were able to hear from Toby. As I said, Toby's not available to be with us to answer any questions. I'm sure people may well have questions in relation to that evidence synthesis in the future, Cochrane side of things. So unfortunately we won't be able to hear from Toby on that. So we're going to spend about 10 minutes on questions now. I see we've got some questions already in the Q&A and I'll work through those. And if there are any additional questions, then please keep adding them to Q&A. So I'll jointly praise these to Olav and Kameshwar. So Kameshwar, if you're able to put your camera back on. And I'll summarize some of the questions and bring them together. We've a series of questions from Vimal Khani about the creation of guidelines. I'm interpreting that as, do you have any guidance on making guidance? Olav or Kameshwar, what would you say to someone who says, how can we create guidelines? How can we select the studies for those guidelines? When should we update them?
Kameshwar can start.
Yeah, I'm not able to put my video on because it has been blocked by host. So you can go ahead, Per. I think I have to write message to
Okay, we can hear you, Kameshwar. We can hear you, but Olav will go first. We'll see if we can get the video on for you, Kameshwar. If not, then we'll just listen to you. But Olav, would you like to take this first?
Yeah, thank you, Mike, and thanks for that question. So creating guidelines, I would say creating trustworthy guidelines according to those standards from the Institute of Medicine and Guideline International Network. And according to methods, as also Kameshwar alluded to, grade being challenging is difficult. And I do think, nevertheless, the standards are very helpful when you create guidelines. So we didn't have time to go through those standards, but you have to, for instance, make sure you have the right people around the table, and typically a multi-professional panel of topic experts, frontline clinicians, patient partners. How to involve patients is a topic in itself. Methodologists. You have to deal with conflicts of interest, and in our work with the BMJ rapid recommendations, we have equal emphasis on intellectual or academic conflicts of interest, like one of the clinicians having published one of the trials or spoken at conferences about how antiplatelet treatment worked for stroke, for example. That's an equally important conflict as if they had worked for the pharma companies. So how to establish a panel, there are nice standards and guidance, how to manage and deal with conflict of interest. The fact that trustworthy recommendations need to be based on systematic reviews, balancing benefits and harms. That's the definition of these trustworthy guidelines. It's of course key. So then you need to work with the evidence synthesizers because few guideline panels have capacity to do their own reviews, and Cochrane and others try to support guideline development by doing focused reviews. And then grade helps in terms of the evidence appraisal, so rating the certainty in the evidence and getting the relative and absolute effects, and to have a structured and systematic process for moving from evidence to decisions or recommendations. So thinking about benefits and harms and certainty of the evidence and values and preferences, resources. So there is a lot of guidance out there to help guideline panels to create these trustworthy guidelines. Again, I think there's a shortage of experts in guideline development, and in particular in advanced methods such as grade, which means most guideline panels need help. And global collaboration is really what we strive for. We don't have resources or time to create or update guidelines in each country or each organization. And that goes for Norway as well, in most countries, even resource-rich settings. So again, I think lots of help and guidance to create those guidelines, but it's a challenge.
All right. So if I may add on what Per has already presented is every country did not produce their own guideline on every topic. In fact, there is a lot of scope for adapting guideline from maybe very well-established societies. And there is a process of adaptation which has also been developed by GRADE group, and one should go through that process, and that process may not take as much time and expertise as developing de novo guideline using GRADE process takes. So, for example, when you are looking at which question should I address, I often say that look at existing guidelines, there may be several, and see if there is any conflict of recommendations. If there are conflicts among different recommendations, then you need to go through some process, because after all, your people, your society, your practitioners need guidance as to what to do in particular circumstances. So pick up those areas where there is conflict. If there is no conflict, there is unanimous opinion or recommendation about certain interventions in certain conditions, there is probably only minor adaptation which is required depending on the feasibility, cost, and resources in one's own country. But no need to do systematic review once again, no need to go through evidence to decision framework. Basically, the local issues and practical issues need to be looked at and accordingly adapt that process. if there is no guideline and you have to go through this process, then as Per has pointed out, starting from forming the team, managing conflict of interest, developing P code, doing systematic review, and quality of evidence or certainty of evidence, and then evidence to decision framework, taking all the considerations which Per has already spoken about.
Great, thanks. So I've got a couple of questions. Just going to spend about 5 more minutes. First, either of you, any advice on how doctors can access guidelines? And I would expand that to doctors and other health professionals, the final people in that joint decision making with patients. How can they access guidelines?
Yes, go ahead, Per.
No, I actually think it's a huge challenge for most healthcare professionals in most countries to find guidelines. And then, of course, the question is, how do you find the trustworthy guidelines? And we need to do better in providing a repository of trustworthy guideline recommendations. And I know Jin is working on this, but we don't really have databases of critically appraised and up-to-date guideline recommendations. I think the COVID-19 rec map, which will be presented tomorrow by Holger Schunman, is one good example how you could pull recommendations from different organizations and have a map of guideline recommendations assessed for trustworthiness. They should all be open access, all free, easily accessible. All the guidelines in Magic App, for example, are open access, free to view. Now we have many societies, and there was a question about the specialties that put the guidelines behind paywalls, which I think is a shame and a huge barrier to access. So I think our society, the EBM society and others should work to make this openly accessible, but also provide better databases, searchable databases, repositories where you can find recommendations. The final point I want to make is getting the recommendations, trustworthy guideline recommendations available in EBM point of care resources, EBM textbooks like up-to-date BMJ best practice, Dynamed, etc., has been a goal for us for 10 years, because I think clinicians want to go one place to find everything. You know, read about etiology and the prognosis and diagnosis and treatment and management and getting slides for education. So supporting the dissemination of guideline recommendations into all sorts of resources where clinicians go first is what we are aiming for, which I think is critical.
Great, thanks, Per. I'm conscious of time, and I don't want to eat into the time of the short break or the next session. So we've got a few questions. Got a question for Toby. Unfortunately, we can't address that, but I have a question from Lubna, and it gives me an opportunity to thank Lubna for inviting me to moderate this session. I've greatly enjoyed it, and I've learned from it, and I've got some questions that I'll probably be sending Per and Kameshwar by email afterwards, so please bear with me. But the question from Lubna, and again, thanks for the opportunity to be part of this. How can you attract the attention of decision makers to get this work done when, as Toby highlighted, it's resource hungry? So what would be your advice, your strategies for getting the key decision makers? So we've talked about the health professionals in the conversation with the patients, but at that level of the decision makers, what can be done? How can we get the resources to do what you've so well described across healthcare? Kameshwar, I'll go to you first, and then I'll go back to Per, and then we'll close the session.
Well, what we have done in India is to go to research organizations who generally fund clinical trials, and now started funding systematic reviews as well. But they don't fund guidelines. So guideline development is a huge task, and of course expensive as well. But if we go and tell the research organizations what's the utility of the clinical trial and systematic review which you have funded, unless it gets translated into practice, it has been at least partly successful, that they realize that it is important activity and they funded it. And the second source are the societies, the research, all the academic societies, whether it is for physicians, surgeons, neurologists, cardiologists, they all love to make guidelines, though it is hard to get funding from them, but it is possible. And the third source is going to the government. So government, of course, wakes up only when there is a pandemic, but even otherwise, if we go and share our experience, what has happened during the COVID, and we were not so well prepared, and it is much better to be well prepared, at least with a group of people who are interested in developing guidelines. There is a possibility of getting some funding there.
Great, thanks, Kameshwar. Per, do you want to add anything to that?
I think that was a nice summary, and I think people deserve a break. So thanks, okay, Kameshwar, for answering the question well.
Okay, and I would just add, I think what you and others have done for COVID is going to give us lots of strong argument for why this needs to happen across other areas. So I will bring us to a close now. We have a 5-minute break, and then you'll be able to hear from a regional perspective some success stories in relation to COVID. And 90 minutes from now, Per's already mentioned it, the workshop by Isabelle Boutron and Claire Ionisi, giving you practical advice on how to do living systematic reviews, learning from their considerable experience with the COVID-19 evidence syntheses. So that's all. Formally close this session. Thanks to Per and Kameshwar and Toby in his absence. Thanks to Lubna for inviting. As I think you have about a 5-minute break. I can see that the moderators for the next session are coming on, but thanks very much from me.
Thank you, and thank Lubna and her team.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone.